after this more fairly idealistic view of the human being and the role of the human being in our industry, I'm afraid I will destroy a little bit of that image and add a bit of a business perspective to what we just heard, and that may be not quite as nice as what we were just hearing. So much about technology. This is kind of a historical picture, and I put that in, and this is the levels and of autonomy developed by Lloyd's Register. I put it in because Lloyd's Register is just in town here. We heard in a previous presentation that we don't, or should rather not speak about levels anymore, but degrees, and also the granular 6 levels at here had been boiled down to 4, as we've also seen earlier today. However, for us, as in the business community, this is relatively helpful still to look a little bit back of where we come from, framing of what we try to look at really is and the first line, in this case, the autonomy level 0, is the type of ship Bill Lal was referring to when he went to sea at first, the kind of entirely manual ship, I'd say, the entirely human-driven ship, going down all the way to the fully autonomous ship. Somehow we are on a voyage, and I would compare it with walking through a city, and the older ones among ourselves know still probably the great pleasure of getting to a city which you don't know very well or don't know at all. You discover it by getting lost. You just go on. And you may have a map and that confuses you to start with, and once you're in the city you are completely confused and you don't use it anymore, and you just spend your day walking around, and then you get to know the city. The younger generation doesn't know that at all, and if you walk through Florence or Venice or any of the popular city, what you see is a lot of people who actually spend their time in the city looking at a small screen to find orientation, to go from A to B. They don't want to be there, they want to get from A to B in a very factual manner. And that also illustrates a little bit on where we are somewhere in between on this, on these various levels. What we also see very practically in this this previous graph, maybe a little further down, is an evolution of the seafarer, and I'm using this term intentionally. The seafarers which work for us on board of the ships, somehow from a role on board of the ships, where we typically see our seafarers, to a second role. And that is also happening and taking place today. We have quite a number of shipping companies already operating remote centers under a variety of names. They are fleet support centers or remote support centers, or we have a few other names for them also. Some of them are for some of the large cruise companies, some for larger container lines. And these are big data-driven centers that kind of virtually look over the shoulders of the seafarers on board of the ships. They have in live all the data that also the seafarers have. And they are currently there just to support the seafarers. I know of one center which actually has more data than the seafarers on board of the ship. In these centers, and that is the good news, employed are seafarers. Experienced people who spend some time of the year on board of the ships and some time or some part of the year in these fleet support centers. And once they detect something which is abnormal, which shouldn't be that way, they have a direct communication line to the responsible seafarers, officers on board of the ship. And they help them, they consult them, like pilots. It's kind of the commercially employed by the company pilots that support the seafarers on board the ship. That is a role that we already have today. And there is a number of companies who invest billions and millions of dollars to create these centers to optimize current operation of ships. And the likelihood that we will see a lot more of these is pretty high. The next role, that was alluded to in one or two previous presentations, which I found quite interesting, is that, and I think it was E4 especially pointing that out, that we have a lot of data out there that we get from the ships, and not only we can use them live, but we can also use them to analyze what actually happened on board of the ships. And I tend to disagree that that is a bad thing. Yes, it takes some of the independency of the seafarers away. It takes a lot of the independency away. Once you analyze through KPIs and a lot of other measures what is actually happening on board of the ship, you improve that. That makes, to use your term, which you just said, maybe monkeys out of these people. I disagree. It somehow puts KPIs to work. It creates an entirely different picture of the independent seafarer. Yes, absolutely. We look over the shoulder in real time of the seafarers that we have so far, and the kind of romantic image of the completely independent people who go from port to port and have no impact to any shore-based reality, that's a time that has gone, and it will not come back at all. To the contrary, and for the better, I believe. Currently, most of us in the room, I believe, we agree that in order to run ships properly, we need suitably certified staff. They need to be physically located on board of the ship, according to the ship's minimum safe manning certificate and according to STCW. I think if we would contemplate the phrase in a few years' time, it would look quite different, and we would probably change it in several places. So in the future, we would need staff just somewhere to oversee the ship, and these people would need training and certification, probably according to self-assessment and according to STCW and the needs of manufacturers. And I will explain that a little later. Importantly, in the process and in the voyage we just currently undertake is that from machines, which I put here in the center, slightly controversial, but it's just the machine perspective here. So the machines, for the time how we knew them, they in the beginning were there for us just to inform us, to give us additional information. Machines also tend to self-improve. They can learn and make themselves, or help to make themselves better through the data they have. Eventually, and this is now the interesting part, is that one machine is informing another machine in collision control mechanisms or others. And eventually, and that's still relatively far away, we may have learning machines. The interesting part is how these machines and humans interact. We saw that in the previous presentation, I think very knowledgeable. And that leads to decisions. And somehow the balance between the machines and the humans is obviously, and this is for some of us slightly frightening, changing. Machines deliver more data, humans may have less of a part in the decision making in the future. And the question is, whom do we trust more? And yes, we may trust some humans, and the discussion is already quite advanced for cars. And do we trust a human-driven car more than an autonomous car? I don't know, and I fundamentally disagree. I don't want to be run over by a car that is driven by a human. I don't want to be run over by an autonomous car either, but the likelihood, and I grew up driving on German autobahns, that people drive irrationally is much higher than my autonomous car driving irrationally. And I would feel a lot safer with a lot of autonomous cars around me. So for me, that's a future I look forward to. And that's maybe the same in the shipping environment. Next part, I would like to have a look with you briefly at some of the stakeholders. We saw a stakeholder map before, and there are 3 stakeholders which I think are very important to look at. One, and the first one, is the manufacturers. When we speak about digitalization and automation of ships, we need to be aware those with the greatest interest in these ships are manufacturers. It's not the classical ship owners, and it's no accident that all, without exceptions, all automated trials are driven by manufacturers. There's barely a single classical ship owner in the equation for the time being. Those that drive automation want to sell products. That is their motivation. It's a great motivation. It's a positive motivation. In our market economies, that's what we want, but we need to be aware who that is. It's not classical ship owners who jump and say, yes, let's buy an autonomous vessel. No. As ship owners, we are rather hesitant, say, let's see what that gives, let's see how expensive that is, let's see once it makes economic sense. For manufacturers, it makes a lot of economic sense today, because we will have a lot of redundancy. There's systems that we can sell. There are, secondly, data companies, and you are familiar with the thought already that there are a couple of companies out there starting to build cars that had nothing to do with cars before. Apple, Google, quite a few others. What they want is the data. They want to manage the data, they want to sell the data, they want to commercialize the data. We may have some of these partners in these trials too. And thirdly, we have cargo owners. They want their cargo to be transported, and they don't care on what type of ship that is, and that's important to keep in mind. The second type of stakeholder we have to be aware of is society at large. And we need, once we move into automated ships, and we have the same discussion on automated cars, we also need a broad agreement by society that that is a move that we should go. It goes beyond technical feasibility and commercial usefulness. We also need a consensus of society that we want to trust automated system, and I think this discussion will also take a few years. And then on the other side, we have the classical part of the industry, and that's owners, managers, crew, those that basically sit in the room here, where we are aware of where we come from and what it is. And both sides, and I would say the blue side and the red side, we come from entirely different angles. And what is important to notice, and Costa said in the beginning, yes, we have to be careful with product orientation, but yes, we have to be very careful with product orientation, but there are stakeholders out there whose entire focus is orientation. They want to sell products. They want to get out with ships that are fully autonomous. And that is very important. And they don't care about STCW. They don't care about MLC so much. They would be just happy to eliminate seafarers. So, and they have no tradition in shipping as anyone else in the room here. So that's not a bad thing necessarily, but we need to be aware that there are these stakeholders out there who have an entirely different from those that have been ingrained with shipping for decades or through several generations. And to put that to the point, is we have on the left side the classical part, and I think that may be some agreement in the room that if you come from a classical ship owner's background, what you want to do is you want to train, reskill, upskill, and evolve your seafarers. If you come from the non-classical side, the seafarers may be a disturbing factor. You would want to avoid them. You want to reinvent what they want, and you would want to limit their role. And a little story at that part. To understand where the manufacturers come from, we also need to look at different industries. And even though it may be a very unpleasant thought, we may get a completely different type of ship owners in the future. We still, and Claire referred to that, we must admit the thought that the ship owner as we know may not be a ship owner in the future. The ship owner in the future may be just a group of manufacturers who bring their equipment together. And you may know the example of Rolls-Royce with airline turbines, where some of the airlines don't own the engines anymore. They own the plane, but the engine is owned by Rolls-Royce. It's just leased. And that is the model that we will probably see in shipping, that the ship will consist of several parts, and the entire system doesn't have a classical ship owner, just a technical integrator maybe. And the various parts are owned by various groups, by various parts of the industry. And that leads to the next thing, which is then very important for the seafarers. Maybe we have to get rid of the notion of the seafarers as we know, or the seafarers as a team on board of the ship. Maybe we will have to disband the team of the crew. Maybe every manufacturer will have their own team and bring it on board whenever appropriate. Maybe there's somebody who brings the engine, somebody somebody the radar, whatever kind of system you can imagine on board. You may have 10, 15 different providers of these technologies and 10 or 15 different people who may have to bring on board their specialists whenever needed. But you don't need a permanent, because no permanent crew will be able to cater for all these highly sophisticated systems. So actually no need for a continuous crew, well, a need for people. But a completely different kind of people employed by a number of different entities. And so we have a completely different notion of a crew and maybe a different notion of seafarers, or we have to abandon our current notion of seafarers altogether. And that may be at the horizon. Okay, I jumped that part briefly. Maybe just a little comforting information from the study we did at HSBA for ICS. We looked at the numbers, and this is just the Clarkson's numbers on the development of numbers of ships, of deep-sea vessels over the last 20 years. What you see is an increase in the sheer number of vessels between 1% and 3% over the last 20 years. We foresee a similar trend to continue. So for the time being, and we predicted in our study for probably the next 20 years, the absolute number, at least, of officers on board of vessels will at least be stable, if not increasing. So for those cadets sitting here, that's a fantastic information. It's, we will need more of you in the foreseeable future. We will need more of you probably in evolving roles, partly ashore, partly on board of the ship. However, this trend of a sheer increasing number of ships may well hide the real trend of less people per ship over the same time period in different roles. And we have to be very careful to observe that at the same time. In the study, we also looked at other industries, and I think that's very instructive, as it was very instructive already to listen to Ifra this morning. We looked at, for instance, the automotive industry, and what we saw there in the early 1970s in Germany, big car manufacturing country, the so-called unmanned factories were introduced. Very similar to what we are talking here today. Our ships are also small factories, and we talk about unmanned ships now. What the result was actually not a cut down on employees in the automotive industry. No, at the same time, the number of people employed increased eventually. However, in entirely different roles. A similar study has been done on India and the Indian automotive industry. The important information there is that we get from all these different industries that we look at is that the roles, the number of people employed in the industries is, despite the automation increasing, but the roles are drastically changing. And to get to the to my end point, just very briefly, these looks at the other industries teaching us that is that innovation, automation, digitalization, and combined in free markets at least, lead to a very dynamic balance of job losses and new jobs, which is deeply worrying for those that lose their jobs, and is a very reassuring information for those that get their jobs. However, these people may not be the same people. So there may be people who get the new jobs, maybe of a younger generation. Some conclusions. I think I will skip those because I got a decent hint that I have to move on. One last thought, important for this crowd, especially for IMEC and maybe also for the ITF, is that we may have to rethink our labor relations in the long-term future. We have to think what kind of person are seafarers, what are seafarers, what roles will we have on board of the ship, and if the role will become much more dual, if the next generation of the seafarers will partly work on board of the ship and partly ashore, are there 100% seafarers, 50% seafarers, and how will we cover them with CBAs, which will be a very tricky issue, and we will have to cover that very, very carefully. And what kind of people are those that remote control ships? Are there seafarers? Are they ship drivers? Are there operators? Some of them will have sea experience, some of them will not. And are they part of our CBAs? Are they not? And I think that will give ample room for in our very future negotiations, certainly next round, but maybe in 10, 15 years' time, it'll be hopefully an interesting question. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you for your presentation. It was excellent. I'm Panos Stavrakakis from Safety Executive, the Science Division. I was wondering, the automation that will come in shipping will bring also other technologies. For instance, the alternative fuels. We are talking for hydrogen, we are talking for LNG, we are talking for ammonia or the total electric ship. I was wondering how the industry is coping to, because these new technologies will bring new risks, novel risks, how the industry is trying to control and mitigate this novel risk, because these risks could be risks for people and for the environment, for the vessel itself, for the cargo. And we're not talking only for the crew, but also for the people that interact with this vessel. We're talking for people that maintain the ship. We're talking for people that, for port workers. So what is the intention for industry to control these risks? In Health and Safety Executive, when there is a new technology, we work with the industry to find out what are the new risks that this new technology will bring, and we're trying to control, to mitigate before they introduce this technology to the society, in order to be a new technology, but at the same time to be safe for the people and the society. Thank you.
Well, I think your last point is the important one, is that we can introduce technologies only if it's being accepted by society, and somehow the regulatory process is a reflection of what society will and can accept. And so that's where we have to convince that either we, as coming more from a classical side, want to introduce such things, but as I pointed out, we need to be highly aware that there will be non-classical operators. And they may push with different means, with different intentions, the same regulators and the same society to move ahead with great rhetoric, with very positively loaded rhetoric, and we need to be very careful that we will not be overtaken by some people in the discussion eventually being lumped into the same group. So we will have probably several levels of discussions there.
Thank you, Max. We're running out of time, so we'll have the chance to revisit the issue later on. Thanks once again.
Thank you.